I came back from leave expecting the usual awkward hugs, bad coffee, and my mom pretending I still needed to be told to wear a scarf. You know, normal stuff. Instead, I walked into a house that felt wrong, too quiet. The kind of quiet that means something already broke, and no one knows how to say it out loud. My mother was crying at the kitchen table, not the relieved kind, not the thank God you're alive kind. This was the dry, exhausted crying you do when you've already explained the situation too many times to people who didn't care. Turns out, while I was on leave from Gaza, her boss decided it was the perfect moment to destroy her. He was suing her for $100,000, for damages, for breach of trust, for things that magically only became a problem once he realized she was alone, tired, and didn't have her daughter around anymore. According to him, she had mismanaged responsibilities and owed the company. According to reality, she'd worked there for 20 years and knew where too many bodies were buried. I should probably mention this. Before my service, this man used to smile at me. Too much. Call me sweetheart. Ask when I'd settle down instead of playing soldier. Joke about how my mother would be easier to deal with once I was gone. I noticed the change right before deployment. His tone shifted. Emails colder. Meetings where my mom suddenly wasn't invited. Tasks reassigned without explanation. I clocked it, filed it away, and left anyway. Because duty doesn't wait for red flags. While I was gone, he escalated fast. He froze her accounts, locked her out of internal systems. Then came the lawsuit. He assumed I was still overseas, or broken, or dead. Pick one. The court date was scheduled for the second day of my leave. My mother didn't even want me to come. "You've done enough," she said. That's when I knew I absolutely had to. The courtroom smelled like old paper and bad decisions. My mother looked small in that chair. Her boss sat across from her like a man already counting money that wasn't his yet. Then the door opened. When I walked in, the room shifted. Not dramatically, subtly. Chairs creaked. Someone stopped whispering. And her boss, this smug, untouchable man, turned pale and stood up like his body recognized the threat before his brain could process it. That couldn't be possible. He stared at me, mouth half open. "It can't be. That's..." Before I left for service, things didn't explode. They rotted. Slowly, quietly. That's how people like him work. At first, it was small changes. My mom stopped talking about work at dinner. When I asked how her day was, she'd say, "Fine, too fast," then immediately ask if I'd packed enough socks. She started checking her phone at night like it might bite her. Emails that used to make her laugh suddenly made her shoulders tense. I remember one afternoon, about a month before deployment. I came home early and found her sitting in the dark, still in her coat. She said she was just tired. I believed her because I wanted to. Her boss had started calling after hours, not yelling. Worse, calm, polite. The kind of voice that sounds reasonable until you replay it in your head and realize every sentence was a threat wrapped in manners. He told her she was replaceable, that the company was reviewing her value, that loyalty goes both ways. Then came the comments about me. "Your daughter is brave," he said once, lingering on the word like it tasted strange. "But you know how these things end. Long absences. People forget who you are." After that, tasks disappeared from her workload. Responsibilities she'd handled for years were suddenly reassigned. She'd find out after the fact. Meetings happened without her. Files went missing. And every time she asked, he'd smile and say, "Relax. You're imagining things." Classic. Right before I left, he pulled her aside and said something that still makes my jaw lock when I think about it. "You'll be alone for a while," he told her. "Best time to keep your head down." When I deployed, the gloves came off. He started documenting everything, every typo, every delay that wasn't hers. He sent emails at 11:58 p.m., and followed up at 6:01 a.m. when she didn't respond. He accused her of mistakes she could prove she didn't make, until he locked her out of the system that held the proof. While I was in Gaza, dodging things I can't talk about here, my mother was being slowly dismantled in an office with glass walls and fake smiles. She didn't tell me, not really. Her messages stayed light. I'm fine. Work's busy. Focus on yourself. I found out by accident. A cousin mentioned the lawsuit in a voice that assumed I already knew. I was standing in full gear when my brain froze on the words $100,000. I laughed at first. Actual laughter. Because it sounded too stupid to be real. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of where I was, but because suddenly everything made sense. The silence, the exhaustion in her voice, the way she kept telling me not to worry. By the time my leave was approved, he had already filed, already told her she'd lose, already suggested a quiet settlement if she didn't want things to get embarrassing. He counted on me being far away. He counted on her being alone. He counted wrong. When I landed and saw her crying at that kitchen table, I realized something cold and grounding. This wasn't just about money. This was about humiliation. And he had no idea who he'd just invited into the room. The confrontation didn't start with shouting. That's the part people expect. Raised voices, slammed tables, drama. None of that happened. It started with paperwork. My mother sat there clutching a folder like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Across from her, her boss was already relaxed. Jacket off, tie loosened. He looked like a man attending a meeting he'd already won. When I walked in, he stood up so fast, his chair scraped loudly against the floor. That sound, metal on tile, cut through the room. Everyone noticed. The judge looked up. The clerk paused mid-sentence. I didn't say anything at first. I just took off my jacket. Not in a dramatic way, not slow, just practical. Folded it over my arm. Underneath, my uniform was unmistakable, clean, pressed, insignia visible. The kind of uniform that makes people recalibrate their tone without realizing they're doing it. His face drained of color. He tried to recover quickly. People like him always do. He forced a laugh that didn't land. This is a misunderstanding, he said, gesturing vaguely in my direction. Family support is nice, but this is a legal matter. I sat down next to my mother. She's not speaking alone, I said. Calm, flat, no heat. I've learned that yelling is a gift to people like him. He glanced at the judge, then back at me, irritation creeping in. With all due respect, this doesn't concern you. That's when he made his mistake. He leaned back, looked me up and down, and said, I heard you were away, playing hero, playing hero. I felt my mother tense beside me. I felt something else too, not anger exactly, more like clarity, the kind that clicks into place when you realize someone is exactly who you thought they were. I was deployed, I said, while you were busy locking my mother out of her own work. His smile stiffened. You don't understand corporate processes. I understand patterns, I replied. And intimidation. He scoffed, loudly, too loudly. This is emotional. Your mother made mistakes, costly ones. I opened my bag and slid a stack of documents across the table. Printed emails, time-stamped, internal memos, access logs, everything he thought she couldn't get once she was locked out. Funny how backups work when someone knows where to look. He stared at the papers like they might bite him. The judge leaned forward. His lawyer shifted in his seat. For the first time, his voice lost that smooth confidence. How did you get those? I met his eyes. You'd be surprised what people collect when they're told to keep their head down. He tried one last angle, turned to me with a thin smile. You should focus on recovery, after what you've been through. There it was, the final insult, wrapped in concern, designed to shrink me. I smiled back. I am focused, I said. on making sure my mother isn't humiliated because you assumed she was unprotected. The room was silent now. Not awkward silence. The kind where everyone knows something irreversible just happened. He sat down slowly. And for the first time since this started, I saw fear in his eyes. I didn't expect the emotional hit to come after the confrontation. I thought once I walked into that courtroom, once I spoke, once I saw him shrink back into his chair, something inside me would settle. It didn't. What settled was something colder. While the judge reviewed the documents, my body finally caught up with everything it had been holding back. Not shaking, not crying. Just this deep, bone-level exhaustion that made every sound feel louder than it should have been. The shuffle of papers, someone coughing, the clock ticking like it was keeping score. I kept my face neutral. That's training. You don't let your face give people leverage. But inside, there was a storm I hadn't planned for. I was angry, not explosive, not cinematic. Angry in a precise way. Angry at how carefully he'd planned this. Angry at how confidently he'd chosen my absence as his moment. Angry that humiliation had been his goal, not just a side effect. Mostly, I was angry at myself, because I hadn't seen it clearly enough before leaving. I noticed the signs, sure, the tone shifts, the comments, the pressure, but I filed them under later. There's always a later, until there isn't. Sitting there, I replayed moments I'd brushed off. The way he once said, "Your daughter won't be around forever." The smile that followed. The way my mother laughed it off afterward, too quickly. I felt guilt twist in my chest, sharp and unwelcome. I had gone to a war zone prepared for worst-case scenarios. I hadn't prepared for this. The quiet dismantling of someone I loved, happening in plain sight. My mother's hand trembled slightly on the table. I noticed because I always notice things like that. I placed my hand over hers, steadying it. She didn't look at me, but her breathing slowed. That's when it hit me hardest. She had been carrying this alone. Every threat disguised as professionalism. Every email written to provoke fear, but not enough to be illegal. Every night wondering if she'd lose her job, her reputation, her stability, while pretending everything was fine so I could focus on surviving somewhere else. I wanted to cry then. Not because I felt weak, but because I felt human again, in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Across the room, her boss avoided looking at me now. His confidence had curdled into something ugly. He kept adjusting his watch, clearing his throat, whispering urgently to his lawyer. Good. Let him feel a fraction of what he'd tried to inflict. The judge finally spoke, voice measured but firm. She asked questions. Real questions. The kind that don't go the way bullies expect. As the hearing paused briefly, my mother leaned closer and whispered, "I didn't want to worry you." I swallowed hard. "I know," I said, "but you don't get to be alone anymore." In that moment, something shifted inside me. Not rage, not vengeance, acceptance. This wasn't about fixing the past. It was about refusing to let humiliation be the final chapter. And for the first time since I'd returned, I felt grounded. Not as a soldier, not as someone who had to be invulnerable, but as a daughter who had shown up exactly when it mattered. The break in the hearing lasted 15 minutes. It felt longer. We stepped out into the corridor, that weird courthouse space that smells like old coffee and stress. My mother sat down immediately, like her legs had finally been given permission to stop working. I stayed standing. Not because I needed to, but because part of me still felt like if I sat, everything I was holding together would loosen at once. Her boss didn't come out right away. When he did, he avoided us completely. Walked past like we were furniture. Like the last 20 years of my mother's life hadn't been spent cleaning up after his decisions. That's when I made my decision. Up until that moment, I'd been operating on instinct. Protect, stabilize, expose. But standing there, watching him shrink into the background, I realized something important. This wasn't just about stopping him. It was about ending his access. I leaned down and spoke quietly to my mother. Not dramatic, not emotional, clear. "You're not settling," I said. "You're not apologizing, and you're not staying there." She looked up at me, startled. "I don't have a choice," she whispered. "I'm too old to start over. And if I lose—" "You won't," I said. Not as reassurance, as fact. "But even if you did, you still wouldn't stay." She hesitated. Years of conditioning don't disappear in one courtroom appearance. He'd trained her to believe survival meant endurance. That dignity was optional. I shook my head. "He chose this moment because he thought you were isolated. That's the only reason this worked at all. And now he knows you're not." Inside the courtroom, things moved fast. His lawyer tried to regain control, talked about procedure, technicalities, suggested mediation, a reduced amount, a quiet end. The judge shut that down immediately. The access logs alone were bad enough. The timing of the accusations worse. But what really shifted the room was motive, the pattern. The fact that everything escalated the moment my mother lost her perceived protection. Bullies hate patterns being named. I didn't say much after that. I didn't need to. The documents spoke. The timeline spoke. His own emails spoke, especially the ones where he mentioned my deployment like it was a strategic advantage. When the judge announced that the claim was suspended pending investigation, and that any further contact with my mother would go through legal counsel only, I felt my chest loosen for the first time in weeks. Her boss didn't look at us when he left. Not pale anymore. Gray. Smaller. Like someone who had just realized the ground under him wasn't solid after all. Outside, my mother cried again. But this time, it was different. Messy. Loud. Relief mixed with grief for all the years she'd swallowed things she shouldn't have. I let her cry. I didn't rush it. Strength isn't stopping emotion. It's knowing when it's safe to let it out. That night, we made a plan. Not revenge, not public destruction. Something quieter, more effective. She'd leave, on her terms, with documentation, with recommendations from people who actually respected her. I'd help her update everything. CV, references, boundaries. As for me, I extended my leave by a few days, not because I was broken, because I was needed. For the first time since returning, I slept through the night. Not because the world was suddenly safe, but because I'd taken back control over one small, vital corner of it. And that was enough to breathe again. People always ask what happens after something like that. Like there's a clean ending. Like once the bully backs off, the damage magically evaporates and everyone goes home healed. That's not how it works. The real aftermath didn't happen in the courtroom. It happened in the days that followed, in small moments that caught us off guard. My mother started sleeping with the light on. She didn't mention it at first. I noticed when I went to get water at 3 a.m. and saw the glow under her door. 20 years of being told to be careful, don't provoke, stay agreeable, doesn't switch off because a judge sided with you. She jumped every time her phone buzzed, even when it was just a spam call. Her body still expected punishment. That's when I realized something uncomfortable. Winning doesn't immediately undo humiliation. Sometimes it exposes how deep it went. Meanwhile, the messages started. Not from him. He'd gone silent, completely. No calls, no emails, no smug, let's resolve this quietly follow-ups. His confidence had vanished overnight. But others noticed. Former co-workers reached out in cautious waves. "I heard something happened. Are you okay? He was asking strange questions last week." One woman messaged my mother privately and apologized. For not speaking up. For laughing along when he made comments. For assuming someone else would intervene. My mother read the message 3 times, then closed her phone and said quietly, "I thought it was just me." That sentence broke something open. As for me, my emotions lagged behind the events. I stayed functional, helpful, calm. I organized paperwork, scheduled appointments, cooked dinner, fixed the door hinge that had been squeaking for months. But inside, everything I'd compartmentalized overseas started leaking through. I snapped at a cashier for no reason, froze when someone raised their voice behind me in the street, woke up once convinced I'd missed a call that never came. I realized humiliation doesn't just hurt the person it targets. It radiates outward. It teaches everyone nearby to shrink a little. One afternoon, my mother asked me a question I wasn't prepared for. "Did I embarrass you?" she said. "By letting it get that far?" I stared at her. "No," I said immediately. "He embarrassed himself. You survived him." She nodded, but I could tell the belief hadn't fully landed yet. That's when I understood my role had shifted. The confrontation was over. The legal danger was contained. But now came the harder part. Rebuilding a sense of safety, of worth, of agency. Not through speeches, not through anger, through repetition, through showing up, through reminding her again and again that dignity isn't something you earn by enduring abuse quietly. It's something you protect by refusing it. For the first time, my mother talked about leaving without sounding afraid. Not excited, just determined. She started listing what she didn't want anymore. Long hours, vague responsibilities, bosses who confused fear with respect. That list mattered more than any resume. As for him, I heard later that the investigation expanded, that people started talking once they realized silence no longer guaranteed safety. I didn't follow the details closely. I didn't need to, because the most important thing had already happened. He tried to humiliate someone he thought was defenseless. Instead, he reminded two women exactly how dangerous they were when they stopped apologizing for existing. And that lesson stuck with both of us. The real shock didn't come from the court decision. It came a week later. I was at the kitchen table with my mother, both of us pretending to read while actually just enjoying the quiet, when her phone rang. She glanced at the screen, stiffened, then looked at me like she wasn't sure if she should answer. "Unknown number." I nodded. "Put it on speaker." She hesitated, then did. A man's voice filled the room, polite, careful, too careful. "This is the compliance department. We're conducting a broader internal review and would like to ask a few follow-up questions." I watched my mother's posture change as she listened. Not shrinking, adjusting. She asked for names, case numbers, timelines, took notes. When the call ended, she set the phone down slowly. "They're scared," she said. That was the moment I knew the power dynamic had truly flipped. Word had spread. Quietly, at first. The lawsuit being paused. The investigation. The fact that the man who liked to dominate rooms had suddenly gone very, very quiet. But the real twist, the one he never anticipated, was that people started asking who I was. Not in a heroic way, not publicly. Just enough whispers to unsettle him. Her daughter? Wasn't she deployed? No, I mean, where? Someone must have looked it up. Someone always does. The day it hit him fully was apparently during a meeting I wasn't in. I heard about it later from a former colleague of my mother's. She told it like gossip, but her voice shook a little. "He was joking about military theatrics," she said, trying to downplay it. Then someone corrected him. Told him where I'd been. What unit. What that insignia actually meant. The room went quiet, she said. Not awkward. Alarmed. Because suddenly his little narrative collapsed. I wasn't an emotional daughter showing up to intimidate him. I wasn't a prop. I wasn't a scare tactic. I was a fact he hadn't accounted for. And men like him hate facts they can't control. After that, people started remembering things. Emails he'd sent that didn't sit right. Jokes that crossed lines. Reviews that seemed timed a little too conveniently. Women he'd sidelined. Men who'd benefited from staying silent. None of this made him special. It made him visible. At home, my mother changed too, subtly, but unmistakably. She stopped asking permission before making decisions, stopped softening her language. When someone from work called and tried to check in, she kept the conversation short and documented everything afterward. One evening, she looked at me and said, almost surprised, "I don't feel afraid when the phone rings anymore." I smiled. That was progress. As for me, I started getting messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. Old neighbors, friends of friends, questions wrapped in concern. "Are you okay? Your mom's boss sounds awful. I heard you scared him." That last one made me laugh, not because it was true, but because it revealed how people misunderstand strength. I didn't scare him by being loud. I didn't threaten him. I didn't even insult him. I simply showed up as myself. And that was enough to unravel everything he'd built on intimidation and assumption. The irony is, he tried to humiliate my mother by isolating her. Instead, he exposed himself to scrutiny he couldn't escape. And once that door opens, it never really closes again. By the end of the week, my mother had 2 interviews lined up. And he was still pretending nothing had happened. But everyone in that building knew. You could see it in the way people stopped laughing at his jokes, in the way his name was suddenly spoken carefully, in the way power drains quietly, long before it's officially gone. And for the first time, I realized something unexpected. The most terrifying thing for a bully isn't revenge. It's being seen clearly by the wrong people, at exactly the wrong time. I didn't expect him to try again. That was my mistake. About 10 days after the hearing, after the compliance call, after the whispers had started circulating, my mother received an email. Not from him directly, he wasn't that stupid anymore, but from HR, copied to legal, written in that bloodless corporate dialect that pretends neutrality while picking a side. In light of recent events, we'd like to invite you to a conversation to clarify expectations and explore a path forward. A path forward. I watched my mother read it. Her face stayed calm, but her jaw tightened in a way I recognized instantly. That micro-expression people get when old instincts try to reclaim territory. "They want to make it look mutual," she said. "Yes," I replied. "And they want to see if you'll shrink again." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she closed the laptop and went to make tea. Her hands were steady. That mattered more than any words. An hour later, she sent her reply. Short, professional, precise. She requested that all communication remain written, that legal counsel be present, that any meeting include documentation of prior access restrictions and retaliatory behavior. When she hit send, she exhaled like someone putting down a heavy bag they didn't realize they'd been carrying for years. That's when the mask really started to crack. The response came faster than it should have. Defensive, over-explained, suddenly apologetic without actually apologizing. HR language scrambled when power is no longer aligned. It's almost embarrassing to watch. Meanwhile, the man himself started unraveling in quieter ways. I ran into someone who knew him, barely knew him, at a cafe near the courthouse. She recognized me, hesitated, then leaned in and said, "He's not doing well." I didn't ask follow-up questions. She filled the silence anyway. Apparently, he'd started snapping at people, misreading rooms, overcorrecting, making jokes that landed wrong, then insisting everyone was too sensitive. The usual spiral when someone who's always controlled the narrative realizes it's slipping. Control freaks don't panic when they lose power. They panic when they lose predictability. At home, the atmosphere changed too, but in a good way. My mother began reclaiming space. She rearranged furniture, donated clothes she'd kept just in case, started walking in the mornings again. Small acts of autonomy that signaled something deeper than recovery. One night, she said something that stopped me cold. "I don't hate him anymore." I looked at her, surprised. "I hate what he did," she clarified. but I don't need him to suffer for me to feel whole again. That's when I knew we'd crossed an invisible line. Because revenge keeps you tethered to the person who hurt you. Even if you're winning, you're still orbiting them. Detachment? That's freedom. A few days later, she got an offer. Not just a job, a better one. Fewer hours, clear boundaries. A manager who actually asked questions instead of issuing threats disguised as feedback. She accepted without negotiating. Not because she couldn't, but because she no longer felt the need to prove anything. As for me, I started feeling the delayed echo of everything. The adrenaline drain, the emotional whiplash. I went for a run one evening and suddenly couldn't breathe. Not from exertion, but from the realization that I'd been operating in crisis mode since I landed. I sat on the curb and let it pass. Strength isn't about never breaking. It's about knowing you'll reassemble yourself differently each time. The last I heard, he was still employed. Technically. But the ground under him had shifted. Oversight increased. Decisions questioned. People documenting instead of trusting. The kind of environment he created had finally turned inward. And that's the thing about humiliation as a tactic. It works until it doesn't. Once people see how it's used, they start recognizing it everywhere. And once that happens, the person who relied on it the most becomes the most exposed one in the room. He tried to make my mother small. Instead, he taught her exactly how much space she deserved. And he taught me something too. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do after service isn't fighting another battle. It's refusing to let anyone rewrite your worth in peacetime. The strangest part was how normal everything started to look again. That's what almost fooled me. My mother began her new job on a Monday. She dressed differently, not more formally, not less. Just like herself. No armor, no safe colors meant to disappear into walls. When she left that morning, she smiled at me and said, "I don't feel sick." That sentence hit harder than any courtroom moment. Meanwhile, the old place kept circling the drain in slow motion, not publicly, not dramatically, but in ways that mattered to people paying attention. I heard more stories than I ever expected. Someone told me he'd been removed from overseeing budgets temporarily. Another said approvals now required double signatures. Someone else mentioned audits, plural, the kind that don't happen unless someone upstairs starts asking uncomfortable questions. Still, no grand collapse, no firing announcement, no satisfying headline, just erosion. And that's when I realized something important. I'd been waiting for a reckoning I didn't actually need. Because the reckoning wasn't his, it was ours. One afternoon, my mother asked if I'd walk with her to the park. We sat on a bench where she used to take me when I was a kid. She watched people pass, parents, dogs, couples, arguing quietly about nothing. "I used to think strength meant enduring," she said. "Keeping your head down, being grateful." I stayed quiet. "Now I think that's just fear dressed up as virtue." She said it calmly, no bitterness, no edge, like someone finally naming the weather after standing in a storm too long. I realized then how much of her life had been shaped by survival instead of choice. How many decisions she'd made based on minimizing risk instead of maximizing dignity. And how easily that pattern could have repeated if I hadn't come home when I did. That thought scared me more than anything else. Because service teaches you how fragile timing is, how lives hinge on minutes, on decisions that feel small until you zoom out. If my leave had been delayed, if the hearing had happened a day earlier, if she'd agreed to settle quietly, everything would look different now. Back at home, I started preparing to return. Packing is always strange after something like this. Folding clothes while replaying conversations, deciding what to carry forward and what to leave behind emotionally. My mother watched me from the doorway and said, "I don't want you to feel like you have to protect me." I turned to her. "I don't," I said honestly. "I wanted to." There's a difference. One comes from obligation, the other from choice. The night before I left, we had dinner without talking about him, or the lawsuit, or work. We talked about trivial things, food, neighbors, a movie we both pretended we'd watched but hadn't. That normalcy felt earned. Later, alone in my room, I thought about humiliation. The way it's designed to isolate, to convince you that you're the only one, that resistance will cost more than compliance. What he hadn't counted on was connection. On people comparing notes, on courage being contagious, on the fact that power built on silence collapses the moment someone refuses to play along. I didn't feel victorious. I felt clear. Clear about my limits. Clear about what I would never tolerate again, whether from a stranger, a superior, or someone hiding behind professionalism. When I left the next morning, my mother hugged me hard, not desperately, not like she needed me to stay, like someone who knew she'd be fine. And that was the real resolution. Not his downfall, not the investigation, not the fear in his eyes, but the quiet certainty that humiliation had failed to define us, and that whatever waited for me next, service or civilian life, I would never mistake silence for strength again. After I left, people assumed the story ended for me. That's another myth, one I believed myself for a long time. That once you walk away from the source of humiliation, once you put distance between you and the people who tried to break you, the experience stays neatly behind you. It doesn't. It follows you quietly, not as pain, but as awareness. Back in service, the days snapped into familiar rhythms. Early mornings, orders given without explanations, long stretches of boredom interrupted by moments that demand absolute focus. On the surface, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. I noticed how differently I reacted to authority. I still followed orders, but I listened more carefully to how they were given. I noticed tone, intent, the line between leadership and intimidation. I hadn't lost respect for hierarchy. I'd gained discernment. That came from watching my mother, from seeing how humiliation works when it's subtle, when it wears a suit, when it smiles while it takes things away. I started catching myself mid-thought. Don't make waves. It's not worth it. Just endure. And every time, I asked a new question. Endure what, exactly? And for whose comfort? One evening, someone joked about me going soft because I pushed back on something small but unnecessary. The old version of me would have laughed it off, kept the peace. Instead, I said calmly, I'm not soft, I'm precise. The room went quiet for half a second, then moved on. But I felt the shift in myself. I also noticed how often people test boundaries without realizing it. A comment here, a dismissal there. Not malicious, just habitual, learned behavior, the kind that thrives when no one names it. I didn't lecture. I didn't escalate. I named things plainly when they crossed lines. Not every time. Not dramatically. Enough. At night, when things slowed down, I thought about my mother starting over, about her walking into a workplace without bracing for impact, about how strange it must feel to unlearn fear after decades of normalizing it. I thought about how close we came to losing that chance. Humiliation doesn't always look violent. Often, it looks boring, administrative, respectable. And because of that, people underestimate its damage. But it teaches compliance. It trains silence. It convinces capable people to doubt themselves just enough to be manageable. Watching it fail, really fail, changed me. I stopped thinking of strength as something loud or relentless. I started seeing it as clarity under pressure, as refusing to accept distorted versions of yourself just because they're convenient for someone else. The man who tried to humiliate my mother didn't disappear from the world. Men like him rarely do. But he lost something far more valuable than status. He lost the ability to operate unnoticed, and I gained something I hadn't known I was missing. Permission. Permission to take up space without apology. Permission to leave environments that demand self-erasure. Permission to define respect on my own terms. I didn't come back from leave feeling heroic. I came back calibrated. And once that happens, there's no going back to the version of yourself who mistakes endurance for virtue. What stayed with me wasn't anger. It was a line I would never cross again, no matter where I was or who stood on the other side of it. And that, more than anything I carried into service, felt like real armor. I didn't post this right away because I wasn't sure what the ending was supposed to look like. Reddit loves clean arcs. Villain exposed, hero vindicated, applause, closure. Real life doesn't do that. What actually happened is quieter, and maybe more important. My mother didn't win in the way people imagine. She didn't get a public apology. There was no dramatic firing announcement, no moment where everyone stood up and clapped. The man who tried to humiliate her still exists somewhere in the system, but he no longer exists in our lives. And that's the difference that matters. Humiliation only works if it convinces you that you're trapped, that leaving will cost too much, that enduring is the same thing as being strong. Watching my mother step out of that mindset, slowly, imperfectly, taught me more about resilience than anything I learned during service. Strength isn't staying when you're being diminished. Strength is recognizing when something is designed to shrink you and refusing to participate. If you're reading this because something feels off at work or at home or anywhere power is uneven, here's what I wish someone had told us earlier. If someone waits until you're isolated to attack, that's not coincidence. If professionalism is used to silence you, it's not professionalism, it's control. If you're being told to keep your head down for your own good, ask who benefits from that. And most importantly, humiliation thrives in silence. The moment you document, the moment you compare notes, the moment you bring another person into the room, literally or figuratively, it starts to fall apart. You don't have to be loud. You don't have to be aggressive. You don't have to be fearless. You just have to be present. I came back from service, thinking the hardest part was behind me. I was wrong. The hardest part was realizing how easily harm can hide behind polite language and respectable titles, and how quickly it collapses when confronted with calm, grounded resistance. If there's one thing I learned from all of this, it's this. Your dignity is not something you earn by surviving mistreatment. It's something you protect by leaving situations that require you to disappear. If you're in the middle of something like this and you feel small, tired, or unsure, none of that means you're weak. It means someone tried to make you believe endurance was your only option. It's not. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't fighting harder. It's standing up, gathering what's yours, and walking out, without apologizing for the space you take with you. Thanks for reading. If this helped even one person recognize what's happening to them sooner than we did, then posting it was worth it.